Hey, tonight we're diving into something a little darker, a time of massive armies, shocking betrayals, and the slow, grinding collapse of the biggest empire the Western world had ever seen. We're talking about the fall of the Roman Empire, not the Hollywood version, but the messy, brutal, and utterly wild reality of it. Forget everything you thought you knew. This is a story of survival, power plays, and things getting very, very weird. You probably wouldn't last a single day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the Roman Empire, but not the one with togas and marble statues everywhere you look. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? You might be living in Belgium in 54 BC, and things are about to get violently real. Imagine this. It's a cold, wet November day, the kind that chills you to the bone, even through tough wool tunics. You're near modern-day Tongres, where Belgium, Holland, and Germany are now just lines on a map. But back then, this was restless territory. You're part of a Roman legion, brigaded for winter. This isn't some cushy posting. You and thousands of your buddies built this camp yourselves. Ditch, mound, rampart, towers, the whole 9 yards. Why? Because Julius Caesar, your boss, likes his troops spread out for the winter, living off the locals. The good news, or so it seemed at first, was that the local tribe, the Eburones, led by their kings Ambiorix and Catuvalaeus, seemed friendly enough. They helped you find the spot, the camp got built on time, and they even started bringing in food. See? Not so bad. Bad news starts hitting about 3 weeks later. Turns out, Ambiorix wasn't as friendly as he seemed. Stirred up by other tribes wanting to kick the Romans out, some Eburones ambushed a small group of your guys who were out foraging for supplies. Wiped them out. Gone. Just like that. Then they charged your camp walls, but thankfully your training kicked in, and a hail of Roman missiles sent them packing for the moment. But the atmosphere in the camp is tense now. Uneasy. You can feel it in your gut. Then Ambiorix and Catuvalaeus show up, claiming it was just a few hotheads, but also dropping hints about a massive revolt brewing, with hordes of Germanic warriors coming from across the Rhine. Ambiorix, putting on his best friendly face, says, maybe your guys should just leave, concentrate your forces with other legions about 50 miles away. He'd even guarantee you safe passage. Now, your commanders, Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta, have a council of war. And let me tell you, it's a shouting match. Cotta and the experienced officers are saying, "No way! We have food, we have a strong camp, Caesar will send help." But Sabinus, maybe a little greener, maybe a little more panicked, is yelling about Caesar being far away in Italy, about the legions being picked off one by one in their winter camps. He's looking at you, the troops, the least experienced legion Caesar has, used mostly for baggage duty. He's whispering loudly that Cotta is being stubborn, risking all your lives. Around midnight, Cotta gives in. Unity is important, apparently, even if the plan sounds like a death wish. So, in the morning, you pack up. And this is where things go from bad to horrific. Believing Ambiorix's lies, you march out not in battle formation, but in marching order, stretched out, loaded down with heavy gear. 2 miles outside the camp, the road dips into a deep, wooded valley. And that's when the trap springs. Eberonis appear on the heights on either side, raining down spears, arrows, sling bullets. Chaos. Your spine is probably screaming louder than the guys getting hit. Sabinus loses his head entirely. But Cotta? He's the real Roman. He and the veteran officers somehow manage to pull the stretched-out column into a defensive square, ditching the baggage. For 8 agonizing hours, you fight. Missiles are tearing through your ranks, but you hold formation. You even try to make small pushes to get out of the valley, but they just expose you to more fire. It's a slaughter. Cotta, even after taking a sling bullet to the face, refuses to surrender. Sabinus tries to parley and gets cut down while talking. That's the signal. The Eburones charge down for the kill. Most of your buddies die fighting with Cotta in the valley. A few manage to break out and get back to the empty camp. But there, facing certain capture and a brutal end, they do the only thing a Roman soldier can do. To a man, they commit suicide rather than fall into enemy hands. 7,000 plus Roman soldiers gone. Wiped out by a friendly tribe in a single day. This is just how your day starts. It only gets worse from here. But hold up. Before you completely despair, let's talk about why. Those Roman soldiers were so terrifyingly good, even when they were losing. See, the Roman Empire wasn't built on luck or just on fancy gear. It was built on discipline, training, and a mindset that would make modern special forces look like a knitting club. Imagine signing up for the legions. You're probably just a teenager, full of vinegar, and not much else. They take you young, pump you full of testosterone-fueled propaganda, and then deny you pretty much any normal human contact. Wives, kids, forget it. They might make you think twice about charging a bunch of screaming barbarians. Then comes basic training. And let me tell you, grueling is an understatement. You have to march 36 kilometers in 5 hours, carrying over 25 kilos of gear every single day, while they scream at you about how special you are, how special your unit is, and how you're part of the elite. It's like the Marines, but according to the Romans, much, much nastier. They could and would beat you to death if you disobeyed. If your whole unit messed up, every 10th man was flogged to death in front of his comrades. Decimation. Yeah. But it wasn't just about fear. They drilled you in small groups, 8 men sharing a tent, training, fighting, and living together. You became closer to those 7 other guys than you were to your own family. Your unit's honor, symbolized by the sacred eagle standard, became the most important thing in your life. You swore on your life and honor to follow that eagle, never desert it. That's why, when Cotta's standard-bearer was struck down, he hurled the eagle over the rampart rather than let the enemy capture it. That bond, that absolute commitment to your unit, that's what kept those guys fighting for 8 hours in that valley, even when they knew it was hopeless. And they trained you for everything. Not just fighting, but building. You learned to construct roads, fortified camps, siege engines. Caesar once built a bridge across the Rhine in just 10 days. Roman troops could control huge areas just from their own camps. Cotta's first instinct, to stay put in the fortified camp and wait for help, was probably the smart move. Another smaller Roman force, surrounded by way more enemies in the Alps, managed to defend themselves for hours from their fortifications before safely withdrawing. Their fighting skills were intense. Forget wild swinging. You were trained to parry with your massive curved shield. The scutum, they copied it from the Celts, by the way, and then stab with your short sword the gladius into the exposed side of your opponent. Your armor, combined with this training, gave you a massive advantage in hand-to-hand combat. That's why Ambiorix kept his guys on the high ground, throwing missiles for as long as possible. He knew what would happen if you got up close and personal. On a larger scale, the legions moved as one, responding to bugle calls, maintaining formation even in the chaos of battle. A good Roman commander could hit hard and fast, or retreat in good order if things went south. Disciplined, organized forces like yours had a massive advantage over even huge numbers of individuals just running around being ferocious. That's why being trapped in that valley was so bad. It negated your biggest strengths. But even then, you fought for 8 hours. 7,000 guys who were mostly baggage handlers fighting to the death. This astonishing fighting spirit, this relentless training, this absolute loyalty to the unit, this is the bedrock the Roman Empire was built on. From its origins as just one city fighting for survival in Italy, Rome expanded, conquering neighbours, taking on Carthage, the other big power in the west, and then spreading across the Mediterranean. Sicily, North Africa, Spain, Greece, Asia Minor, all fell under Roman sway. The Mediterranean was always the prize, but to hold it, you had to move north into non-Mediterranean Europe. Northern Italy first, then parts of France. The desire for glory among Roman leaders fueled expansion into areas that weren't even that profitable or strategically vital. Thanks to Caesar, all of Gaul, then parts of the Danube region, the Alps, and eventually Britain and modern Bulgaria were added to the mix. By about 43 AD, the northern borders settled on the Rhine and the Danube rivers, and there they pretty much stayed for the rest of the empire's history. This wasn't just about brute force, though. The Romans were also incredibly shrewd diplomats, mixing targeted diplomacy with total ruthlessness. Caesar could be merciful to captives if it served Rome's interests, and he was careful not to overburden tribes who surrendered. But if you resisted, watch out. After finally crushing Carthage, Rome didn't just defeat it. They wiped the city off the map, ploughing the site with salt as a symbol. Their greatest enemy in the east, Mithridates, the king of Pontus, responsible for massacring thousands of Romans and Italians, was hunted down until he was forced to commit suicide. Even then, he had to ask a guard to stab him because he'd built up a tolerance to poison. Caesar himself could be utterly merciless. Opposition leaders were flogged to death. Entire groups who didn't surrender, sold into slavery, or just outright slaughtered. When a town that had massacred Roman traders put up a fight, Caesar's legions went in and killed pretty much everyone, men, women, and children. Only 800 survived out of 40,000. We don't know if Caesar exaggerated the numbers, but the point was clear. Resist Rome and face utter destruction. And they never forgot. The Eburones, the ones who wiped out Cotta's legion. Caesar hunted them down, burned their villages, and even invited neighboring tribes to join in the pillaging. One of their kings, Catuvolius, was so despairing he hanged himself. The other, Ambiorix, the one who tricked Cotta, spent years on the run, his fate unknown. Roman revenge was relentless and total. This mix of force and cunning diplomacy allowed Rome to build a massive state, stretching thousands of kilometers. And it lasted. For a staggering 450 years, from the time of Augustus to the 5th century AD, Rome held onto this vast territory. To give you some perspective, counting back 450 years from today takes you back to the 1500s, before Queen Elizabeth I in England, to a Europe tearing itself apart over religion. The Roman Empire lasted an immense period of time, and because it lasted so long, it changed a lot. The Roman Empire of the 4th century AD was almost unrecognizable to Julius Caesar. Some historians have argued that these internal changes, things like the rise of Christianity or economic problems, were the real reasons for the empire's eventual collapse. They believe Rome was so weakened by the 4th century that it just crumbled under its own weight in the 5th. But, as we'll see, while the empire definitely changed, the idea that it was internally rotten and ready to fall isn't the whole story. The real roots of the collapse lie elsewhere. To understand that, we need to take a closer look at what the Roman Empire was like in the 4th century, how it had changed, and why those changes didn't make it inherently weaker. Let's start with Rome itself. In the 4th century AD, the city was still huge, a sprawling imperial beast. Visitors still came to gawk at its monuments, the Forum, the Colosseum, the palaces. Emperors kept adding to its glory with new arches and columns celebrating their victories. The city's population was massive, maybe 1 million people, swollen by revenues from the rest of the empire. Feeding them all was a constant headache, especially since huge numbers still got free food, bread, olive oil, wine, as their due as citizens of the conquering power. This is why Rome needed 2 massive ports, Ostia and Tibur, just to handle the food coming in. And excavations in North Africa, a major source of grain, show the huge harbour built there just to load ships for Rome. At the heart of the city, in many ways, was the Senate. Back in Caesar's day, it was the political powerhouse, a bunch of rich landowners and ex-officials from around Rome, dominating politics and economics. By the 4th century, there were probably very few direct descendants of those old families still in the Senate. Part of that is just genetics. Monogamous marriage doesn't guarantee male heirs for many generations. But even if the bloodlines were mixed, the wealth and the mindset were the same. Take Quintus Aurelius Symmachus, a famous senator from the late 4th century. We know him from his letters and speeches. He was ridiculously wealthy, owning estates all over Italy, Sicily, and North Africa. His peers owned land in Spain and Gaul, too. This spread of wealth still reflected Rome's history of conquest. Lands won in wars centuries before were still in the hands of their descendants. Over the centuries, new wealthy families joined the Senate, but it remained the top of Roman society, the goal everyone aspired to. Symmachus and his buddies were very aware of their history, of the weight of their institution. Symmachus called the Roman Senate the better part of humankind. He didn't just mean richer, he meant better in a moral sense, more virtuous. This idea that wealth and power were tied to moral superiority was pretty common back then. They justified their position with their education, a specific intense study of a few classical Latin writers: Virgil, Cicero, Sallust, and Terence. Imagine spending 7 years from age 8 doing a deep dive into just 4 authors, analyzing every single word, every grammatical twist. Then you move on to rhetoric, studying more texts, but with the same intense focus on language. The goal wasn't just to understand the texts, but to internalize them, to learn to speak and write correct Latin, a language that was probably quite different from the everyday speech of most Romans by the 4th century. It was like a secret code, instantly marking you as one of the elite. But it wasn't just about language. They believed these texts contained a database of human behavior, good and bad. You learned from examples. Don't get drunk and throw spears at your friends like Alexander the Great supposedly did. But also more subtle lessons about pride, endurance, love. They believed that only through this kind of education could you develop the full range of human emotions to reach the highest state you could. It was a forge for creating truly civilized human beings. This education also prepared you for leadership. Having learned to identify virtue, you were then equipped to persuade others to lead. This meant framing just laws, holding office with integrity, setting a public example. You had to control yourself before you could control others. You also had a duty to the literary tradition itself, studying ancient texts, sometimes producing new editions. Most importantly, you had to maintain good relationships with your peers. Symmachus' letters are full of recommendations for younger friends, praising their integrity and purity of manners. But the real point of the letters was simpler, confirming you were part of the club, one of us. There was a strict etiquette to letter writing, almost a ritual. Failing to write could cause suspicion. Once a relationship was established, it was valuable for favors, promotions, anything really. This world of elite education, social rituals, and a deep sense of historical importance would have been familiar to Caesar. He was a man of letters and oratory himself. Cicero, one of the authors Symmachus studied, was his contemporary. While the rules of literature got more complex over 400 years, the basic idea of an elite defined by exclusive education and destined to lead was the same. Caesar would also have recognized the vast majority of people in Rome, the non-elite. Symmachus only mentions them in passing, but the basic need for bread and circuses to keep them happy and prevent unrest was still there. When food from North Africa was short, the common people rioted. Using wine to make concrete when they were short on wine was a definite rioting matter. Symmachus's father had to leave the city because of it. Keeping the populace entertained with games and spectacles was crucial. Symmachus went to great lengths for his son's games, importing Scottish hunting dogs, slaves, and even trying to get crocodiles that were refusing to eat to perform before they expired. So, looking just at the city of Rome, you might think not much changed between Caesar and Symmachus. Still a huge, bloated capital, dominated by a self-important elite. But Rome was just one piece of the puzzle, and even there, change was happening under the surface. To see the real transformation, we need to leave Rome and head north. Imagine yourself in early winter 368-9, traveling with Symmachus. He's leading a senatorial embassy north of the Alps, heading to Trier, a city in modern-day Germany where the borders of France and Luxembourg meet. This used to be the territory of the Treveri, the tribe whose leader helped stir up the Eburones who wiped out your legion back in 54 BC. If Caesar's ghost was on this trip, any feeling of familiarity he might have had in Rome would vanish instantly up here. One big, obvious change. Symmachus and his friends are bringing crown gold to the reigning emperor, Valentinian I. This was a payment from the cities of the empire on an emperor's 5th anniversary. Back in Caesar's day, there was no emperor, just powerful, feuding politicians whose rivalries led to civil wars. The title of emperor, claimed by Caesar's nephew Augustus, was a novelty. By the 4th century, it had transformed entirely. For one thing, the pretense of being a republic was long gone. Augustus tried to pretend the Senate still had important functions, but by the 4th century, everyone knew the emperor was an autocratic monarch. Ideas about rulership from the Hellenistic kingdoms that came after Alexander the Great's empire had seeped in. Legitimate rulers were seen as divinely inspired, divinely chosen. The emperor was sacred, communing with God. You had to prostrate yourself before him, throw yourself on the ground. If you were really privileged, you might get to kiss the hem of his robe. Emperors had to play the part too. One emperor, Constantius II, was praised for being so controlled in public that he didn't spit, wipe his face, or even move his hands. He was supposed to appear superhuman. And 4th century emperors weren't just acting more powerful, they were more powerful. Take lawmaking. Back then, legal innovation came mostly from academic lawyers. By the 4th century, all important legal matters went to the emperor. He completely dominated the process. Same with taxes. His officials had a much more direct role in collecting them. Emperors had always had the potential for huge authority. By the 4th century, much of that potential was reality in ceremony and in function. Another fundamental change, it was now normal to have more than one emperor ruling at the same time. It wasn't always formal, and sometimes one man tried to rule alone. But for most of the 4th century, the job was split, often between an emperor in the west and one in the east. They tried different models, one senior emperor with junior colleagues, Caesars, or equals sharing power, Augusti. Sometimes it was family, sometimes not. The rule of 4, tetrarchy, at the end of the 3rd century was a famous example of non-relatives sharing power. By the 5th century, the split between East and West was pretty much a formal system. The fact that Symmachus had to travel north to find Valentinian for such an important occasion shows another huge transformation. In the 4th century, emperors hardly ever visited Rome. It was still the symbolic capital, still got tons of money, but it wasn't the political or administrative center anymore. New power centers had grown up closer to the frontiers. Milan in Italy, Trier, Sirmium on the Danube, Nicomedia and Antioch in the east became important, especially under the Tetrarchy. By the 4th century, Milan and Trier in the west, and Antioch and the new capital, Constantinople, in the east, were the major centers. As one orator put it, Constantinople was perfectly located to link Europe and Asia, to be a hub for trade and movement. Rome, by comparison, was a sacred precinct, far from the highway. It was too far from the main frontiers, the Rhine, the Danube, and the Persian front, to be an effective command center. Information was too slow getting in, and orders took too long to get out. The strategic axis of the empire ran along the Rhine and Danube, across the Balkans and Asia Minor to Antioch. All the new capitals were on or near this line. But it wasn't just about logistics. Caesar had to return to Italy to secure his political position, to win friends and influence people in the Senate, the one and only place where Roman political power struggles happened. By the 4th century, the critical political audience had changed. Emperors didn't need to be in Rome because they were playing to a different crowd. The imperial court, wherever it was the source of everything ambitious Romans wanted: wealth, titles, favors, promotions. All that tax money flowing in was redistributed from the imperial presence. As one speaker told the Emperor Constantine, wherever the emperor visited, everything increased: people, walls, favors. In Caesar's time, all that wealth was distributed in Rome to influence the Senate. 400 years later, that would be political suicide. Patronage had to be spread much wider. The critical political audience of the 4th century was the army, or rather its senior officers, and the growing imperial bureaucracy. Generals had the military muscle, but bureaucrats controlled finance and law. No regime could function without them. There had always been powerful officials, like the emperor's freedmen in the early empire. But by the late empire, the central bureaucracy was huge. In 249 AD, there were only 250 senior bureaucrats in the whole empire. By 400, there were 6,000, mostly at the headquarters near the frontiers: Trier, Milan, Sirmium, Constantinople, Antioch. The Senate of Rome was no longer the key player. The generals and bureaucrats in these new capitals were deciding the empire's fate. The imperial throne usually passed down through families, but only if the generals and bureaucrats agreed. There were times of dynastic breaks when these powerful figures would discuss candidates. Army officers often got the nod, but bureaucrats could contend for power too. One bureaucrat, suspected of plotting, was thrown down a well. Another, who used a séance to find out who the next emperor would be, was executed. Ironically, the séance spelled out the name of the actual next emperor, Theodosius. This shift in the geography of power was fundamental. Armies, emperors, and bureaucrats had all moved out of Italy. This also explains why you needed more than one emperor. Administratively, one emperor couldn't effectively control all three major frontiers from one place. Politically, one centre of patronage wasn't enough to keep all the senior generals and bureaucrats happy and prevent usurpations. Each army group needed its share of the spoils, paid in gold, and its officers wanted promotions and favours. The same went for the civilian side. Concentrating all patronage in one capital would leave too many powerful people out in the cold. Emperors who tried to rule alone often faced trouble. Theodosius I, based in Constantinople, refused to appoint a co-ruler in the west and faced discontent and dangerous usurpers who felt they weren't getting their piece of the imperial cake. This decline of Rome's importance wasn't sudden. Emperors had been travelling more since the 1st and 2nd centuries, sometimes with a co-ruler. But by the 4th century, the glory days of the Republic, when the Senate was the centre of everything, were long gone. The Senate's role was mostly ceremonial. Individual senators were still rich and could have important careers. But the Senate as a body had little power in policy-making, and the senatorial career path became purely civilian, with no military commands, making it hard for senators to become emperor, a role usually held by generals. Senate meetings were just for show, sending minutes to the emperor, receiving imperial messages. They weren't involved in active decisions, except maybe about their own tax contributions. The Senate was full of wealthy taxpayers, but it wasn't a major player in the power struggles. Not surprisingly, the status of senator was gradually diluted. Before the 4th century, Roman senators had unique status, immune from local obligations, with special financial and legal privileges. Over the 4th century, emperors promoted huge numbers of their new bureaucrats to senatorial status. In 367, Valentinian created a new system aligning all imperial service honours, making Clarissimus, most distinguished, the senatorial title, everyone's goal. By 400, all 6,000 top bureaucrats had senatorial status, either in office or on retirement. This took away the unique social niche of the old Roman senatorial families. Even worse, with so many clarissimi, emperors created higher ranks, spectabiles and illustres, mostly for those with active bureaucratic service, not just birth. At the same time, a second equal senate was created in Constantinople, filled with new men and some old Roman senators already living in the east. Between 250 and 400, the blue-blooded senators of Rome saw their cherished position eroded by a massive expansion of the senatorial class and the rise of a rival senate in the east. All these changes created a political world Caesar wouldn't recognize. The emperor was now a divinely appointed monarch of an inside-out empire, ruling from capitals near the frontiers, usually with a co-ruler, with vast authority. The imperial bureaucracy was the new aristocracy, replacing the marginalized Senate of Rome. This is why Symmachus's embassy had to go all the way to Trier. These transformations raise a bigger question. If the empire was physically just as large in Caesar's day, why did you need multiple emperors and wider patronage to prevent revolts in the 4th century? To find the answer, we have to look closer at Trier, command center for the Rhine frontier. Roman Trier started small, a military post on the Moselle River, deep in the territory of the Treveri, those guys who caused so much trouble. But the Trier Symmachus saw in 368-9 was something else entirely. It was a bustling Roman city, a bastion of Romanness on the Rhine. If you arrived from the west, you'd enter through the Porta Nigra, the Black Gates, the best surviving Roman city gate anywhere. It's impressive now, but back then it was a statement. Massive iron portcullis, courtyards, 4-story towers bristling with guards. This gate survived because a holy man made it a church in the 10th century. The rest of the city walls were quarried away over time. In Symmachus' day, it was part of a 6-kilometer, 3-meter thick, 6-meter high wall enclosing 285 hectares. Another huge gateway dominated the bridge over the Moselle. Inside, the city was no less spectacular. In the early 4th century, the whole northeast quarter was rebuilt as an imperial center, palace, cathedral, circus, baths. Imperial ceremonies were held in the circus, with underground passages connecting it to the palace. The remains of the baths and the basilica, the emperor's massive audience chamber, still stand. The basilica alone could fit the Porta Nigra twice. It was in that basilica that Symmachus and his embassy presented Valentinian with the crown gold. The building was stunning, patterned tile floor, marble walls, statues, and the emperor seated in the apse, veiled by curtains until the big moment. Surrounded by civilian and military dignitaries in their elaborate robes, the scene was one of splendor and order, all eyes drawn to the imperial personage. A short speech, the job was done. But Symmachus didn't leave. He stayed around Trier for the rest of the year, plenty of time to see the city and the surrounding area. And what he saw was deeply Roman. The new imperial buildings were built onto an already Roman city. Near the bridge was one of the largest bath complexes outside Rome. There were municipal buildings, law courts, a city council hall dating back to the 1st century, an amphitheatre larger than those surviving in France. 50 temple shrines, the largest complex in the West, an aqueduct bringing water from 12 kilometers away. By the 2nd century, Trier was a proper Roman urban space, and it kept growing. This transformation wasn't just Trier. All over northern Gaul, Britain, Spain, North Africa, the Balkans, Asia Minor, the Near East, Roman cities dotted the map. Many in the Mediterranean were old Greek cities that the Romans took over. Elsewhere, cities were built from scratch, sometimes by Roman veterans, but often, as in Trier, by the local people. Trier's official name, Augusta Treverorum, Augusta of the Treveri, tells the story, founded under Emperor Augustus for the very tribe that had caused so much trouble for Caesar. 1st and 2nd century Trier was built by members of the Treveri who wanted their own Roman city. Inscriptions show local people paying for public buildings. They were so eager to be Roman, they borrowed heavily from Italian moneylenders. The Roman city of Trier, like others across the empire, was built not by immigrants from Italy, but by the local inhabitants. Same with the villas, those country houses. By the 2nd century, you couldn't tell if a villa was built by an Italian Roman or a provincial. These towns and villas weren't just buildings, they were spaces for living a Roman life. Public baths, temples with ceremonies for the whole town, council houses for local self-government. The Romans, following the Greeks, believed that self-government was essential for creating civilized human beings. Building Roman towns wasn't just about putting up buildings. It was about reforming local life after a Roman pattern. Discoveries in Spain show how this worked. After the Roman conquest, local communities rebuilt themselves as Roman towns and inscribed their new constitutions on bronze tablets. These laws were massive, detailed documents composed in Rome, laying down who could be on the council, how officials were chosen, how justice and finances worked. The local towns could only change a few details. These constitutions, and the villas, reflected Roman ideas about civilized life. Mediterranean values spread in other ways too. Burying the dead outside the city walls, turning grain into bread instead of porridge. Small, everyday things that changed life in the provinces. Within a century or two of conquest, the whole empire had become Roman. The old idea of Roman Britain ending suddenly with the legions leaving and everything going back to native ways isn't accurate. By the late Empire, the Romans of Roman Britain weren't from Italy. They were locals who had adopted the Roman lifestyle. Britain, like everywhere else from Hadrian's Wall to the Euphrates, was Roman by choice, by identity, not just by occupation. Symmachus eventually headed back to Rome in 369. He'd seen the Romanness of the Moselle Valley firsthand. His embassy was a success. He even got a court title, Count Third Class. He milked his court connections for years, especially with younger men looking for introductions. One of his most important contacts was the Gallic rhetorician, Ausonius, older than Symmachus and tutor to the future emperor Gratian. Their correspondence is fascinating. Symmachus, the blue-blooded Roman, approaches Ausonius, a provincial from Gaul, with deference, recognizing his superiority in Latin. This shows how much the world had changed. The idea that a Roman senator would look up to a Gaul for his Latin skills would have been preposterous to Caesar. Latin language and literature spread across the empire because conquered peoples bought into the Roman way of life. It wasn't just learning enough Latin to trade. It was accepting the whole value system, the idea that this education made you a superior human being. This same process created Roman towns and villas where they hadn't existed before. The models came from the Mediterranean, and sometimes Roman veterans were settled to show the locals how it was done. But in Trier, the Roman city was built by the local Treveri, eager to show how Roman they were. This changed what it meant to be Roman. When the same political culture, lifestyle and values spread across that huge area, Roman became a cultural identity, not just a geographical one. It was open to everyone, and this had a massive consequence. Having adopted Romanness, the new Romans wanted a piece of the political pie, a share in the power and benefits of the empire. As early as 69 AD, there was a revolt in Gaul, partly driven by this new identity. It was put down, but by the 4th century, the balance of power had shifted. Symmachus in Trier saw clearly that the better part of humankind wasn't just the Senate of Rome, but civilized Romans everywhere. Now that your mind is boggling at the sheer scale of Romanization, let's talk about the folks on the outside, the barbarians, and how they shaped the empire, often in ways no one expected. Imagine yourself now in AD 15, about 300 kilometers northeast of Trier, in the Teutoburg forest. 6 years before, 3 entire Roman legions, maybe 20,000 men, were annihilated here in one of the most famous battles in history. You're with the Roman army under Germanicus, Caesar's nephew, returning to the scene of the disaster. And it's gruesome. The ruins of the Roman camp are still there, a testament to the soldiers' labour. Then you see the last stand, a half-ruined defence line. And then the open ground. Whitening bones scattered everywhere, piled up where they made their last fight. Fragments of weapons, parts of horses, human heads nailed to trees. In nearby groves, the altars where Roman officers were sacrificed. Survivors who escaped the battle or captivity point out where the generals fell, where the eagles were lost, where the commander, Varus, committed suicide rather than be captured. It's a horrific scene, a larger version of what happened to Cotta's legion, betrayed and wiped out. The difference? The tribe responsible, led by Arminius, later known as Hermann the German, wasn't conquered. The area between the Rhine and the Elbe rivers remained outside Roman control, its culture showing none of the Roman influence that spread through Gaul or Britain. This divide between lands that became Romanized and those that didn't is still visible today in the languages of Europe, between those descended from Latin and the Germanic languages. On the surface, you might think this explains the eventual fall of the Western Roman Empire to Germanic kingdoms. Germania resisted Roman conquest tooth and nail and eventually had its revenge centuries later. This was certainly the view of 19th century German nationalists who built a massive monument to Hermann, celebrating his victory over the Romans. But here's a shocker. If you asked a 4th century Roman where the biggest threat was, they wouldn't say Germania. They'd say Persia in the east, and they'd be right. Around 300 AD, Persia was a far greater threat than any Germanic tribe. A closer look at the evidence suggests the Roman legions stopped expanding into Germania not because of fierce resistance, but for entirely different reasons. In the 1st century AD, Germanic-speaking groups were spread across Central and Northern Europe, from the Rhine to beyond the Vistula River. The Romans called them the Germani. Trying to understand their way of life is tough. They didn't have writing, so our information comes from Roman sources, who saw them as barbarians and were mostly interested in whether they were a threat. Roman writers painted them with broad, negative strokes. Little survives from the Germanic side to correct this biased view. Archaeology helps fill some gaps, but it has a complicated past. Emerging in the nationalist fervour of the 19th century, it was used to claim vast areas as ancient German homelands. But modern archaeology shows that ancient Germania wasn't just Germanic. It was a mix of populations, with Germanic speakers dominating politically in many areas they'd expanded into. More importantly, 1st century Germania was politically fragmented, over 50 small groups, often fighting each other. They might unite for a short time under a leader like Arminius or for a specific purpose, but there was no lasting unity. They were as likely to fight each other as the Romans, sometimes with brutal results. One account describes 60,000 people being massacred in a battle between tribes. 19th century visions of an ancient German nation were way off. So why didn't Rome conquer this fragmented world like it did Celtic Europe? The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was a disaster. But like the Eburones' ambush, it was a one-off that the Romans eventually avenged. Germanicus crushed Arminius in later campaigns. Arminius himself was murdered by his own people. The underlying reasons for stopping at the Rhine and Danube were different. Part of it was logistics. Rivers were easier to supply troops on. The Rhine-Moselle route allowed supplies to come directly from the Mediterranean. But the real reasons were about Roman ambition meeting the realities of the local economies. Roman expansion was driven by leaders wanting glory and wealth. They conquered rich areas, which brought in tribute and made the general famous. But eventually, they started taking territories that weren't that profitable, not worth the cost of conquest. Britain, the sources say, was conquered just for the emperor's glory. The Roman expansion stopped in an area between two different material cultures. The more developed Latin culture, associated with the Celts, and the simpler Jastorf culture, associated with the Germani. Latin Europe had larger settlements, coins, and some literacy, supported by an economy with food surpluses. Jastorf Europe was more subsistence level, focused on herding, with no cities or literacy. The Roman advance stopped not at an ethnic line, but at a major economic one. Most of the wealthier Latin Europe was taken into the empire. Most of the poorer Jastorf Europe was not. This fits a pattern seen in other empires. Expansion stops in areas where the local economy can't support the army, making further conquest unattractive. Emperor Tiberius realized Germania wasn't worth it. Its dispersed population was harder to control than the concentrated populations in the Celtic towns. The logistic convenience of the Rhine and the limited economy of Jastorf Europe combined to stop the legions. Germania as a whole was too disunited to be a major threat. The Hermann Monument is in the wrong place, not just geographically, but symbolically. It wasn't German military strength that kept them out. It was their poverty. As a result, the Roman frontier settled on the Rhine and Danube by the mid-1st century AD and stayed there. West and south of this line, populations became Romanized. North and east, Germania remained, in Roman eyes, the land of unreconstructed barbarians. The same label was applied to the Persians in the east, but the Persians were a completely different level of threat. Imagine standing at Naxi Rustam in Persia, looking at inscriptions from Shapur Puan's King of Kings in the 3rd century AD. He boasts of crushing Roman armies, destroying emperors, even having one skinned and tanned. This wasn't Roman propaganda. This was real, and it signaled a strategic revolution. Before this, resistance in the east came from the Parthians, rulers of a sophisticated world in Mesopotamia, a land of great empires. The Parthians had some successes against Rome, but by the 2nd century they were weakening. Emperor Septimius Severus even pushed the frontier east. This threw the Parthian world into crisis, and a new dynasty, the Sasanians, rose to power in the 3rd century. The Sasanians weren't just another local power. They were a rival superpower. Shapur I's inscription details crushing defeats of Roman armies, the deaths of 2 emperors, and the capture of a 3rd, Valerian, who was later skinned. This wasn't a fluke. The Sasanians were more efficient, consolidating outlying regions, using Roman prisoners for massive irrigation projects, increasing tax revenue, and building a professional army. Shapur even claimed the entire old Persian Empire, including Roman territories. Before this, Rome dominated all its frontiers. Local losses were reversible. Now, facing a rival superpower, Rome's whole strategic situation changed. It had to defend against a much more powerful enemy in the east, while still holding the line on all other frontiers. This required a massive increase in Roman military power. By the 4th century, the army was larger and reorganized. The old legions were broken into smaller units. The army now had frontier garrison troops and mobile field forces near the main frontiers. The field forces were better equipped, but the garrison troops were formidable too, not just farmer soldiers. There were more specialist units: archers, artillery, heavy cavalry, some copied from the Persians. While cavalry was more important, infantry still dominated the mobile forces. The size of this late Roman army is debated. Maybe 400,000 to 600,000 men, compared to 300,000 in the early 3rd century. Even a conservative estimate means a huge increase, and that needed funding. The largest expense was always the army. Funding a third larger military machine meant radically changing the empire's finances. This was a response to the rise of the Sasanians. 3rd century emperors first grabbed all existing revenue sources like city funds. City officials still collected taxes, but the money went to the state. This wasn't popular, but it was an easy way to get cash. But it wasn't enough. They also debased the coinage, reducing the silver content. This meant more coins, but massive inflation. Prices skyrocketed. Debasement only bought short-term breathing space. The only long-term solution was higher taxes. In times of stress, they levied extraordinary taxes in food. Unpredictable, very unpopular. Under Diocletian, a new regular tax on production, the annona militaris, was systematized. The sudden rise of Persia in the 3rd century forced a massive restructuring of the Roman Empire. The changes weren't instant, but they worked. By the end of the 3rd century, the Eastern Front was stabilized. Rome was holding its own against the Sasanians. Warfare became more about sieges of fortifications than damaging invasions. Losses still happened, but not on the scale of the 3rd century disasters. The Romans had adapted, but this effort came at a high cost. Confiscating city revenues and raising taxes wasn't easy. It took 50 years to get the finances in order, and it required a massive growth in the central bureaucracy to oversee it. Military and financial changes had huge political consequences. Power shifted away from Rome and Italy, and needing more than one emperor, already appearing in the 2nd century, became a necessity in the 3rd, driven by political as well as administrative needs. Emperors had to be in the east to deal with Persia, leaving the west with less imperial presence. This meant soldiers and officials in the West felt left out of the patronage system, leading to political turmoil at the top. In the 50 years after 235 AD, there were 20 legitimate emperors and a host of usurpers, each averaging only 2.5 years in office. This military anarchy showed a deep structural problem. Emperors focusing on one part of the empire created disgruntled rivals elsewhere. The Gallic Empire, a separate Roman regime in Gaul for 30 years, was a way for the local military and bureaucrats to ensure they got their share of imperial resources. So, in different ways, Rome's two major neighbors profoundly influenced its development. The limited economy and political fragmentation of the Germani made them unprofitable to conquer, setting the European frontiers on the Rhine and Danube. The Near East, with a martial population, a history of political cooperation, and a richer economy, became a rival superpower under the Sasanians. Their rise forced Rome to expand its army, taxes, and bureaucracy, leading to huge political shifts. But through all this, Rome's ideology didn't change. Barbarians were still seen as irrational, inferior beings. Imagine a hot August day in 370 AD. Saxon raiders slip out of a German river, sail west, and land in northern France. The Romans corner them and negotiate a truce. The Saxons hand over young men as hostages and are supposedly allowed to leave. Good news? Bad news. While negotiating, the Romans secretly positioned troops between the Saxons and their ships. Then they attack, wiping out the raiders. Not one escapes. One Roman historian justifies this as destroying a destructive band of brigands when the chance arose. As far as Romans were concerned, double-dealing to kill barbarians was perfectly acceptable. Killing barbarians was popular entertainment. Roman amphitheatres saw gladiatorial combat, executions, and watching barbarians die. Hundreds of thousands died in the Colosseum alone. In 306 AD, Emperor Constantine fed 2 captured Frankish kings to wild beasts in Trier. He made sure everyone heard about it. If no kings were available, any barbarian would do. In 383 AD, a Roman senator wrote about the pleasure of watching Sarmatians being slaughtered by gladiators. For him, these deaths symbolized civilized Roman order triumphing over barbarian chaos. This hatred wasn't just random, it was based on a Roman worldview. Humans had rational spirit and physical body. Above humans were purely spiritual beings. Below, animals, pure physicality. Romans, with their education and self-control, were fully rational. Barbarians, ruled by their bodies, were not. They were irrational, driven by desires for alcohol, sex, and wealth. They reacted wildly to fortune, despairing at setbacks, unlike rational Romans who planned and endured. Barbarian society was seen as where might made right. Barbarians were the crucial other, their failings justifying Roman superiority and legitimizing Roman rule, which was seen as divinely ordained. This ideology helped Romans accept heavy taxes needed to defend against barbarian threats. But this ideology had costs. Seeing neighbors as inherently inferior meant conflict was the norm. Rome was divinely favored, destined to conquer, always victorious. Any failure meant the emperor wasn't right for the job. So emperors had to spin events to maintain the image of invincibility. When Emperor Julian's Persian expedition ended in disaster in 363, his successor had to negotiate a humiliating peace, giving up territory and cities. But he couldn't admit defeat. His coinage claimed victory, and his spin doctor argued the Persians had shown their support by throwing down their weapons. This spin didn't fool anyone. Yet catastrophic losses were now rare. Rome generally had the military edge on its European frontiers. With a little spin, victory could usually be claimed. Violent confrontation was a key part of Roman foreign policy, but reality was more complex. On the Rhine and Danube, relations weren't always just them and us. To see this, let's look at the lower Danube frontier in 369 AD, where the Roman Empire faced the Gothic Tervingi. Emperor Valens, ruler of the East, met with Athanaric, the Gothic leader, on a barge in the middle of the Danube. Valens was trying to end a 3-year war. His spin doctor claimed Valens utterly perplexed the barbarian, who went away both confident and fearful, cast down by losses but exulting in success. The Goths on the riverbank were a disordered rabble compared to the disciplined Roman soldiers. The peace terms seemed to confirm Roman dominance. Valens ended annual gifts, restricted trade, and built defences. But look closer. The war wasn't started by Valens, but by Athanaric, who sent Gothic troops to support a Roman usurper. Valens hadn't defeated the Goths in battle, only managed to ravage their territory when the frozen Danube prevented them from escaping. The Goths were suffering food shortages, but they weren't totally subdued like they were under Constantine 30 years before. Why did the treaty impose harsher terms? The spin doctor forgot to mention a crucial detail. While Valens was campaigning against the Goths, the Persian king of kings had attacked in the Caucasus. Protecting the Eastern Front was more important than totally subduing the Goths. This new threat pressured Valens to make peace quickly, even a compromise. The meeting on a barge, instead of Roman soil, implicitly acknowledged Gothic sovereignty. Themistius had to spin the peace to the Senate. Ending gifts was a small gain. The real loss was the right to call on Gothic military aid against Persia. Themistius's speech painted a picture of Gothic submission, with Valens all-powerful. And his bravado worked. The peace was seen as reasonable. But behind the spin, Athanaric was no simple barbarian. He and his people had received Roman gifts for years, but risked them to avoid fighting for the empire. They risked trade privileges too, visible in the archaeological record. Roman wine containers found at Gothic sites. Athanaric had a clear agenda: reduce Roman domination. He rallied support and used sophisticated strategies, even getting involved in Roman internal politics. Here's a reality check for Roman ideology. A Roman allying with a barbarian against another Roman, and the barbarian isn't just aiming for plunder, but renegotiating a treaty. Athanaric was a client king with a coherent political plan. He even rejected Roman attempts to Romanize his father, a hostage in Constantinople, and later he persecuted Gothic Christians, rejecting a policy promoted by emperors. Now meet Ulfilas, Little Wolf of the Goths. Two manuscripts give us a direct look at the Gothic world. The Codex Argentius, a luxurious copy of a Gothic Bible translation, and a more modest manuscript containing a letter from a bishop who knew Ulfilas. Ulfilas was born around 300 AD, son of Roman prisoners living among the Tuvingi. His family was taken during Gothic raids into Asia Minor. His name is Gothic, showing adaptation, but he grew up literate in Latin and Greek. This suggests Roman prisoners lived in autonomous communities among the Goths, able to maintain their culture. Many were Christians. Ulfilas became a junior clergyman. His life changed when Emperor Constantius II decided to help Christians living under non-Christian rule. Leveraging the military dominance his father had over the Tuvingi, Constantius arranged for Ulfilas to be ordained bishop for the Christians in Gothia. Ulfilas ministered to his flock for 7 years, but something went wrong. In 347-8, he and many other Gothic Christians were expelled by the Tuvingi, perhaps because he was spreading his message beyond the prisoners, or because Constantius wanted Gothic troops for his Persian war, and this was the price. Constantius greeted Ulfilas like Moses. It seemed like an end, but it was a beginning. Ulfilas and his followers settled near the Danube frontier. Here, Ulfilas produced the Gothic Bible, the first literary work in any Germanic language. He translated word for word from a Greek Bible, using Gothic with Greek grammar. It was a huge feat. Tradition says he skipped the Book of Kings, fearing it would make the Goths more warlike. The other part of the story is told in the bishop's letter. After Constantine's conversion, defining Christian doctrine became crucial. The Council of Nicaea defined the relationship of father and son. But debates continued. Ulfilas was a traditional Christian who disagreed with the Nicene definition, arguing it contradicted Scripture. And people listened. He preached in Greek, Latin, and Gothic, arguing for one flock under Christ. He was influential, courted by emperors, building a group of non-Nicene bishops. He was still arguing doctrine at age 70. This humble Gothic subject became a major player in 4th century religious debates. Again, reality clashes with the Roman image of irrational barbarians. Athanaric and his council weren't stupid. They devised ways to cope with overwhelming Roman power, negotiating, looking for opportunities. Lower down, Roman prisoners maintained their culture, producing a trilingual scholar like Ulfilas, who shaped religious debates. Roman Gothic relations weren't just conflict. They were a diplomatic dance. Romans were dominant, but Goths were useful. Raiding was common, but major conflicts were generational. When they happened, Romans usually established military dominance, often by ravaging territory or winning battles. Julian's victory at Strasbourg was a stunning example. Military victories allowed for diplomatic settlements, but they varied. Formally, barbarians surrendered and became Roman subjects. In reality, terms differed. If Rome was in control, they interfered in tribal politics. They extracted recruits and resources. Hostages were common, sometimes influencing future leaders to be pro-Roman. But where Rome was less in control, they had to pay for resources and accept existing political structures. Either way, beyond the frontier lay a belt of Germanic client kingdoms, part of the Roman world. They weren't fully under Roman control. Athanaric showed that. If Rome was distracted, they could push back. Usurpations in the West allowed one Alemannic leader to build up his power. But when Rome reasserted control, they were quickly brought back into line. These kingdoms also had their own politics, fighting each other, inviting each other to feasts. Overall, Roman-German relations didn't fit the simple barbarian image. They were reciprocal, if unequal. Client kingdoms traded, provided troops, were influenced by Roman culture. They received aid and sometimes respect. Treaties sometimes followed barbarian norms. The Germani had come a long way. This new order was based on transformations within Germanic society. Tribal names changed in the 3rd century. New confederations appeared. Gothic expansion in the east created large political units. Migration played a role, but not always a complete replacement of the population. Beneath the new names, some old groups remained, but with new layers of authority. Overkings appeared, wielding more power than others, even if the position wasn't always hereditary. Archaeology reveals deeper changes. Farming settlements from the 1st century show villages with many houses, unlike earlier scattered farms. New agricultural techniques, like using manure and crop rotation, allowed for more permanent, clustered settlements. This spread over centuries, leading to very substantial settlements in Gothic territories. Ploughing techniques improved. More intensive agriculture meant more food, and population increased, visible in cemeteries. Other parts of the economy changed. Iron production increased massively. Pottery shifted from handmade to wheel-made, fired at higher temperatures, showing skilled craftsmen. Luxury goods, like glass, initially imported from Rome, were eventually produced in Germania. Metalwork changed too. Intricate silver and gold items appeared, reflecting growing wealth. Some villages specialized in crafts, like comb making. This new wealth wasn't spread equally. It sparked competition for control, leading to new authority structures. Just like the Industrial Revolution created a new class, the Economic Revolution in Germania created powerful elites. Military forces were key. Families who could recruit and maintain armed retinues could pass on their power. These retinues provided the enforcement for claims of high status. Retinues had other uses. They enforced the will of leaders. The persecution of Christians by Athanaric was carried out by local communities and retinues, showing a mix of central policy and local autonomy. This also revealed that local communities might not always follow central orders, even if they were enforced by retinues. Germanic society remained a broad oligarchy. The warrior aristocracy was important, but power wasn't limited to a tiny nobility. Kings couldn't just give orders, they had to persuade a broad audience. They had rights to demand agricultural produce and military service. They settled disputes and represented their people in foreign policy. Our understanding of these changes shows why Rome focused on Persia. Persia was a superpower. Germania, even with its transformations, was politically fragmented, not a unified threat. Temporary alliances had become stronger confederations, and royal status was inherited, but no Germanic leader could unite the region against Rome like the Sasanians did in the east. However, the population increase, economic development, and political restructuring made 4th century Germania a greater potential threat. The belt of Roman client kingdoms only extended 100 kilometers beyond the frontier, leaving large areas outside regular Roman control. This balance was vulnerable to outside shocks. The rise of the Sasanians was one. Could Germania pose another? Yes. Established client states were targets for groups further away who benefited from economic ties to the empire. These frontier regions became richer than outer Germania. This drew aggression. This was true in the 2nd century, and later with the Goths moving into the Black Sea region to seize wealth. But the danger was only latent because Germania lacked unity. The larger kingdoms and confederations, while stronger, were still junior partners in the Roman system. Rome didn't always get its way, and there were periodic conflicts, but generally the barbarians knew their place. An appeal to the emperor, humility, tears. It worked. The later Roman Empire was keeping the barbarians in check, and despite the cost of dealing with Persia, it was stable on its European frontiers. It wasn't destined to fall under its own weight. Now that we've explored the Roman world and its neighbours, let's look at the internal limitations that shaped the empire's response to the crises to come. Imagine yourself in North Africa around 373 AD. Romanus, the military commander, has just been fired for provoking a rebellion. The general sent to clean up finds incriminating evidence, a letter from a bureaucrat hinting at a cover-up. Lying to the emperor is treason. The bureaucrat commits suicide rather than face torture. The full, nasty story emerges. It started a decade earlier after raiders hit a town. The townsfolk wanted Romanus to retaliate, but he demanded camels they refused to provide. He did nothing. The outraged citizens complained to the emperor. Romanus got his side of the story to the emperor first, through a contact at court. The emperor ordered an inquiry, but it was slow. More raids, another complaint from the townsfolk. The emperor got angry and sent the bureaucrat Palladius to investigate, also giving him money for the troops. Palladius saw the truth of Romanus's inaction. But Palladius was also stealing from the troop funds. He threatened Romanus, who in turn brought up the embezzlement. A devil's bargain. Palladius kept the cash and told the emperor the townsfolk had lied. The emperor, thinking his time was wasted, unleashed the law on the complainants. Palladius was sent back to oversee the trials. With him as judge, the outcome was fixed. Bribed witnesses lied. A governor and 3 townsfolk were executed for lying to the emperor. The matter seemed closed until Palladius's letter came to light 6 years later. 2 townsfolk who had escaped execution by going into hiding re-emerged, and the full story came out. The guilty parties, Palladius, Romanus, and the contact at court, met their end. On the surface, this looks like corruption, a sign of decline. But corruption was rampant in Roman society, always. Power and money were linked. Getting power was often about getting rich. This wasn't a new problem. It hadn't stopped Rome from rising. It didn't fundamentally cause its collapse. Romanus and Palladius just took it too far. But look closer. This incident shows a fundamental limitation of Roman central government. The emperor was supreme in theory, but he couldn't be everywhere. An issue in Africa, thousands of kilometers away, couldn't be investigated directly. He had to rely on reports from a few officials. If they lied and kept other information from him, he was forced to act on bad information. Imagine trying to run an area larger than the European Union today, with no phones, no faxes, no internet. Communication was incredibly slow. Theophanes' journey from Egypt to Syria took 3.5 weeks, averaging about 40 kilometers a day. Emergency messages could go faster, but official travel moved at the speed of an ox cart, and you had limited lines of contact. The emperor heard from a few officials, a few deputations. If they presented a united false front, he had no way of knowing. Official travel was also incredibly complex. You needed letters of introduction, gifts, huge amounts of cash, and often armed escorts. You had to bring your own bedding, even a portable kitchen. Places were incredibly far apart in real terms. Running the empire was like running an entity 5 to 10 times the size of the EU today. With places so far apart and so few lines of contact, the emperor couldn't interfere systematically in daily life. Government focused on a narrow range of issues: the army and taxes. Even tax collection was largely handled locally. As long as the money flowed to the center, local communities were largely left to govern themselves. This was key to the empire's internal history. Lepsius Gate shows not a unique problem of the late empire, but the inherent limitations of Roman central government at all times. Despite their power, emperors' control was limited by distance and communication. Yet their authority was absolute when applied, and citizens constantly sought it out. This created a dynamic where individuals and communities used the center's authority for their own ends, even if it meant presenting a biased version of the truth. This was true throughout Roman history. Towns in the provinces adopted Roman constitutions because local elites saw it as a path to Roman citizenship and influence. It had a shady side. Courting patrons at the center was key. This relationship between center and locality was the foundation of the empire. The rescript system, where anyone could ask the emperor for a legal ruling, was another example. Hundreds of requests were answered yearly, but the emperor lost control of the ruling once it was sent out, leading to abuses. Emperors were reactive, and their power, though potent when applied, was often deployed randomly based on who managed to get their ear. In the mid-3rd century, the rise of Sasanian Persia forced this limited government to confront new problems. It responded with military, fiscal, and political restructuring. But some argue these changes, while saving the empire in the short term, doomed it to collapse later. They claim the higher taxes crushed the economy, ruined landowners, and led to land abandonment and forced labor. They say the larger army was filled with unreliable, barbarian recruits. The empire became oppressive, losing the consent of its people. These views are deeply entrenched, but recent scholarship challenges them. It argues the late Roman world had considerable economic, political, and ideological vitality. Let's look at the economy. Ancient agriculture had limitations, dependence on labor, and inability to greatly increase yields. Transport was expensive. The economy operated near subsistence levels. Traditionally, it was thought higher taxes made it impossible for peasants to survive, leading to land abandonment. Evidence included the decline in public inscriptions, seen as landowners lacking funds, and laws about deserted lands and tying peasants to the soil. But archaeological discoveries have overturned this. Extensive surveys show rural prosperity in the late Roman period, with increasing settlement and production in many areas, including North Africa and the Near East. This prosperity began or continued well into the 4th century, precisely when the traditional view said taxes were crushing farmers. Late Roman Britain may have reached population levels not seen again for 1,000 years. The only areas not booming were Italy and some northern provinces, perhaps due to 3rd century disruptions or shifts in building materials and pottery that make settlements archaeologically invisible. Italy's decline was relative, as its economy had been artificially boosted by conquest spoils and untaxed agriculture. Advantages lost as provincial economies developed and Italian land was taxed. Despite higher taxes, the late Roman countryside was generally flourishing. This changes how we see the literary evidence. Laws tying labour to the land make sense only with high rural populations. Deserted lands may just mean untaxed lands, not necessarily abandoned farms. A demanding tax regime is compatible with a strong economy if taxes encourage production by forcing farmers to produce beyond subsistence needs. This doesn't mean life was easy for peasants. Taxes were higher and movement restricted. But evidence suggests a late Roman countryside at or near maximum population and production. Cities, however, did change. Public inscriptions declined, reflecting fewer new public buildings funded by local elites. Only imperial capitals saw large-scale construction funded by the state. Private funding of public building, a route to social advancement, disappeared as local revenues were confiscated. By the 4th century, running a town council meant doing errands for the central government, not gaining wealth and influence. Retired imperial bureaucrats took over the important local jobs, attracting local favour. The image of the bureaucracy as an oppressive force is also challenged. While some sources complained about the low origins of some bureaucrats, evidence shows most came from the traditional landowning classes, those who could afford the necessary education. The bureaucracy didn't consist of outsiders, but of town councillors who had found a new path within the changing empire. Bureaucratic expansion was driven by demand from these elites, who saw government jobs as attractive due to the status and fees involved. It wasn't an oppressive state forcing its will, but locals adapting the system to their interests. Understanding bureaucracy this way changes the view of curial flight. It wasn't economic ruin, but a shift in career patterns for landowners. They were still a rentier class, living off peasant labour. But now they were doing it through imperial office, not just local councils. Their state salaries were low. The appeal was status and fees. These changes in elite careers didn't fundamentally alter their lifestyle. They still moved between urban and country homes. Major cities near imperial capitals prospered as landowners maintained houses there instead of smaller hometowns. New evidence shows that despite higher taxes and confiscated local funds, the agricultural economy wasn't in crisis and landowners weren't ruined. Curial flight was a political adjustment. 5th century collapse wasn't caused by 4th century economic problems. Claims that the army was short of Roman manpower and relied too much on barbarians also need rethinking. The army did recruit men from across the frontier, either in temporary units or as career soldiers. But this wasn't new. Auxiliary forces had always been non-citizens. The main change was barbarians, sometimes serving in the same units as citizens. Training remained tough, and historical accounts don't show declining discipline or disloyalty among these troops. The restructuring of the empire didn't fundamentally weaken the military. However, the extra costs and changes might have alienated provincial populations who had embraced Romanness. With Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity, ideological structures began to change. Some, like Gibbon, saw this as a cause of collapse, arguing Christianity sapped military spirit, spread superstition, diverted wealth to the church, and caused political division through religious disputes. They feared it undermined state power. 4th century sources do complain about taxes, and there was a major tax riot. But generally, tax collection worked. Emperors stressed that taxes funded the army, necessary for defense. Propaganda reinforced this. Military failures were sometimes criticized for wasting taxpayer money, but the system held. The Antioch riot was an isolated incident caused by an extra tax. Landowners tried to minimize their tax bills, but emperors managed to collect funds without tearing society apart. Christianity did bring cultural revolution. Town landscapes changed as cemeteries moved inside walls. Churches replaced temples, leading to a glut of cheap marble. The church received large donations. Christianity was democratizing, emphasizing the soul's equality regardless of status, which clashed with traditional aristocratic values. Intellectuals created a new ideal: the uneducated Christian holy man who found wisdom and virtue beyond classical education. Monasticism grew, attracting many. High-status Christians sometimes renounced their wealth and lifestyles. Christianity challenged many traditional Roman practices, but it didn't seriously damage the empire's functioning. Church wealth replaced pagan wealth. Manpower lost to monasteries was small. High-status individuals renouncing wealth were few compared to those joining the bureaucracy. Many landowners became Christian while holding office. Religion and empire quickly found a way to coexist. The idea that Rome was divinely destined to conquer was simply reinterpreted with the Christian God as the divine power, and Christian conversion as the highest state for humankind. Emperors, no longer deified, were seen as God's chosen representatives, ruling in his place. The imperial presence remained sacred. This wasn't just court propaganda. The ceremony introducing the Theodosian Code showed the Senate, a thoroughly Christian body, proclaiming the emperor's divine role and the perfection of the Roman social order under God's law. This message was reinforced in ceremonies across the empire, from town councils to greetings for imperial images. Christian bishops endorsed the idea, arguing Rome's rise under Augustus coincided with Christ's birth to facilitate worldwide Christianization. Emperors involved themselves in church affairs, calling councils, making laws, influencing appointments. The church hierarchy mirrored the empire's administration. Christianity was Romanized. It adapted to reinforce the emperor and state. Christianization wasn't without conflict. Some intellectuals rejected the empire. Doctrinal disputes caused turmoil, but mostly among bishops, rarely causing widespread damage. The rise of Christianity, like bureaucratic expansion, shows the center's ability to draw local elites into line. It spread through a trickle-down effect as emperors favored Christians for office. Local conversion followed, with temples closing where Christian opinion was strong. By the end of the century, a critical mass of decision-makers were Christian, allowing for more aggressive Christianizing policies. The center exerted influence not through force, but by making conformity a condition for advancement. Christian and Roman became prerequisites for success. Taxes were paid, elites participated, Christianity was integrated. Far from causing collapse, Christianization and bureaucracy showed the center's continued pull on provincial loyalties. Now let's look at the Roman political system itself and its inherent limitations. The ceremony for the Theodosian Code, with its choreographed acclamations, shows a powerful state machine. But the specific demands made by the senators also reveal limitations. They insisted on many copies of the code, kept under seal, written out in full letters with no annotations to prevent falsification. They asked that no laws be made in response to individual requests. This shows a fear of abuse, of laws being manipulated at a distance. This points to a limitation: the emperor's inability to systematically oversee the application of law across the vast empire. While law was ideologically central to the Roman idea of a just society, its practical application was open to manipulation. Another limitation, clear from the acclamations being addressed to two emperors, Theodosius II and Valentinian III, was the division of power. Necessary for administrative and political reasons, one emperor couldn't handle everything, and multiple centers of patronage were needed to prevent usurpations. It was incredibly hard to manage without generating conflict between rivals. Harmony was rare, usually requiring one emperor to be clearly dominant. When power was shared between equals or when succession was uncertain, civil war was likely. Periodic conflict was the price of integrating elites across the vast empire. It was a systemic feature, not a flaw, giving a rhythm to politics. Periods of stability were broken by conflict until a new regime balancing various interests emerged. These civil wars didn't make the empire vulnerable to outside conquest in the 4th century. A second major limitation was the narrow base of political participation. To play a part in the empire, you had to be a wealthy landowner, able to afford the necessary education and local or imperial office. This class, perhaps less than 5% of the population, benefited most from the system. Below them were urban professional classes, and the vast majority, peasants, who were largely excluded, experiencing the state mainly through tax collection. Their attitude was likely indifference, though low-level resistance and banditry occurred. While a core limitation, this wasn't new and wasn't worsening in the 4th century. A more significant limitation stemmed from the landowner's lifestyle. Their wealth and status were based on land, an immovable asset. If the state, whose laws protected their ownership, weakened, they were vulnerable. They couldn't simply move their wealth. They had to make accommodations with whoever held power in their locality. Their participation in the Roman system was a cost-benefit calculation. Pay taxes for protection. If the tax burden became too high or the state couldn't protect their property, their loyalty was up for renegotiation. In the mid-3rd century, the empire faced a new range of problems from Sasanian Persia. It responded with restructuring, but traditional arguments say this weakened it. However, new evidence suggests the rural economy was booming, not collapsing, and landowners adapted their career paths. The army, though reorganized and perhaps relying more on non-Romans in some areas, wasn't fundamentally less effective. Christianity was integrated without destroying state ideology. The empire's internal limitations, while real, weren't fatal on their own. They made the empire unable to deal with all problems simultaneously, but not inherently doomed to collapse. Without outside pressures, there's no sign the Western Empire would have fallen in the 5th century. Now let's talk about the real external shocks that brought down the Western Roman Empire. This wasn't a natural, inevitable decline. It was a violent process driven by forces from outside the empire's borders. The first shock was the arrival of the Huns in the late 4th century. There's no definitive reason why they moved when they did. Environmental changes, social shifts, military factors like their powerful composite bows might have played a role. But their movement into the area north of the Black Sea triggered the Gothic migrations of 376 AD. The Goths, who arrived at the Danube, desperate to escape the Huns, forced their way into the empire. While some were initially allowed in, the ensuing war and eventual peace treaty of 382 left large groups of unsubdued Goths on Roman soil. This was a new problem for the empire, creating a large, armed group within its borders that had its own agenda. The second major shock was the further westward movement of the Huns to the Great Hungarian Plain around 410 AD. This displaced more Germanic peoples: Vandals, Alans, Suevi, Burgundians, who invaded the Western Roman Empire between 405 and 408. These invasions caused massive destruction in Gaul and Spain and led to the permanent loss of territory and tax revenue as these groups established themselves within the empire. These invasions weren't random. They were pulses of migration generated by the Huns' expansion. They weakened the Western Empire by draining its resources and disrupting its administration. But crucially, the Germanic groups who invaded were different from the ones who had interacted with Rome centuries before. Over the centuries, Germanic society had changed. From fragmented, relatively poor tribes, they had developed larger political units, wealthier economies, and more sophisticated social structures, partly through interaction with the Roman Empire, trade, military service, Roman diplomacy that favored certain leaders. When the Huns arrived, these more organized Germanic groups were better able to respond, either by fleeing en masse across the Roman frontier or by forming larger confederations under the Huns. This is a critical point. The major barbarian kingdoms that emerged from the wreckage of the Western Roman Empire, the Visigoths, Vandals, Franks, Ostrogoths, were new political entities formed during the period of crisis and invasion, often through the forced amalgamation of smaller groups. The Visigoths, for instance, were created from the Tuvingi, Greuthungi, and the survivors of Radagaisa's Gothic invasion. The Vandal kingdom in Africa was a coalition of Hasding and Siling Vandals and Alans. These supergroups were larger and more cohesive than any Germanic groups Rome had faced before. The Roman Empire, in its attempts to manage these groups, actually contributed to their unification. By presenting a common threat and offering opportunities for wealth and status within the empire, Rome inadvertently encouraged these groups to put aside their differences and unite. Roman military pressure pushed fragmented groups together for defense. Roman wealth and diplomatic recognition provided incentives for leaders to consolidate power and attract followers. The empire's military power and administrative sophistication, usually its strengths, inadvertently helped create the very forces that would dismantle it. The Huns played a paradoxical role. While their invasions caused immense damage, their indirect impact in generating the earlier migrations was more strategically damaging. And, after Attila's death, the collapse of the Hunnic Empire removed the force that Aetius had used to keep the other barbarian groups in check. This forced the Western Roman Empire to try to build regimes by including these powerful groups, leading to a bidding war for their support that further drained the empire's limited resources. In the end, the Western Roman Empire fell not because of internal decay, but because a series of powerful outside groups whose strength and cohesion had partly been shaped by their interaction with the empire itself, established themselves on Roman territory and gradually seized control, a process initiated and accelerated by the unpredictable arrival of the Huns. It was a violent process of external conquest and internal fragmentation, not a gentle decline. The Roman Empire, through its own overwhelming presence and its relationship with its neighbors, inadvertently sowed the seeds of its own destruction. And so, as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the people of the Roman Empire, Romans and non-Romans alike, caught up in these earth-shattering events. Remember the Roman soldiers fighting to the death in a valley in Belgium, their unit, their life. Remember the cities like Trier, built by locals who embraced Romanness. Remember the Goths, fleeing the Huns, seeking a new home within the empire, only to find themselves in a brutal war. Remember Ulfilas, the Roman prisoner who created a written language for the Goths. Remember the vastness of the empire, stretched thin by distance and limited communication. Remember the barbarians, complex societies, not just mindless attackers whose interactions with Rome transformed them. Remember the political maneuvering in the imperial court, the struggle for power, the rise and fall of generals and emperors. Remember the devastation of the invasions, the loss of provinces, the shrinking tax revenues. Remember the resilience of provincial life in some areas, clinging to Romanness, even as the central state dissolved. Remember the final scramble for power, the rise of new kingdoms, and the ultimate end of the Western Roman Empire in 476. Their world was one of hardship, uncertainty, and dramatic change. But it was also a world of incredible human resilience, of adaptation, and of the forging of new identities from the ashes of the old. The comfort and stability of our own world, the ease of communication, the safety of our homes, these are luxuries they could only dream of. So as you sleep, perhaps appreciate the long, winding, and often brutal path that led from their time to ours. The fall of Rome was a cataclysm, but it also paved the way for a new world to emerge, a world whose roots, in unexpected ways, reach back to those distant, tumultuous centuries.